There was an article in the New York Times this week, and it was about a producer whose name was Michael Apted, who died this past week in his 70s. You may know him because he helped produce the film Coal Miner's Daughter, which I remember from the 80s. But this article highlighted a documentary project that he worked on the entire span of his career. And it was, I've never heard of it before, but it's called Up. He started it in 1964 and it's continued ever since. And what it was basically was he had this vision that he was going to follow a group of people over the course of their lives from childhood all the way to adulthood. And so he began with 20 children from the public schools in England. Their families agreed that they could participate. And he interviewed them, I think at around 7 years old. And then every 7 years, he would come back and he'd interview them again. And he'd use the same structure every time. But each time, their lives would have changed in those 7 years. And then he'd take those interviews and he'd create a new installment of the series. And they would go back and review who each person was, but then they would bring in this new installment. And he said, it's interesting, he said over the years, he'd bring on new producers and there'd be new technology and they'd always want to make some change, some glitzy new addition. They'd always want to make the show sleeker or flashier. But he always stuck to the same graceful structure, as he called it, the usual playbook. Interview, spare, and then taking the lives of these people and showing them on the screen. And he did this, he said, so that the lives of these people could be seen. He says it was about people and what they say and who they are. It was about all their stories. So I was thinking about that as I was thinking about our liturgical seasons of the year, because I think they offer this same kind of graceful structure and the stories that go along with them. They are the structure that help us make sense of our lives, that give us shape and meaning to the very particularity of our lives, and especially as they change over time. They're this framework that we can come around to again and again and help make sense of what's going on with us and what's going on in the world. That's never felt more true for me this year in this Epiphany, where so much is happening in the world, so much is happening in our own lives. We just celebrated the Feast of the Epiphany on January 6th, a major feast day for our church, where we celebrate Jesus as the light of the world. We did this on the same day that we watched protesters, looters, killers ransack our capital. We saw the worst of our human instincts given free rein, and we watched that on TV. This year, the soil's been tilled up under our feet. It's been tossed around. It's been tilled up for a while now. And those issues that we saw playing out and that are afflicting this nation, they're not going to go away. The genie that's been fed well for so long, that's been fattened up, is now fully out of the bottle. And it's going to take everything we have to put that genie back in and to figure out what to do about that genie, how we all move forward together as a country. So that's the context of our lives. Never mind COVID. That is the context of my sermon today. And I ask myself, in the midst of the season after Epiphany, in the midst of our lessons today, what is the good word? What is the good word in the midst of this? First, we have the Epiphany. I went back and reread that story, and there were these bits and pieces to it that I hadn't noticed before, one particular one. Remember how the wise men travel from the east to Jerusalem and they find Herod, and Herod tells them to go to Bethlehem and to find the children born king of the Jews. And then Herod tells them to report back to him. Well, I hadn't noticed this one detail in the story before till I went back and reread it. It says that Herod and all of Jerusalem were afraid. They were afraid. Herod responds to that fear with cruelty. After he hears of Jesus' birth and the Magi don't return and report to him, he orders all the male infants under 2 to be killed, the slaughter of the innocents, as it's known, set right down in the midst of our Christmas season. But what about all those others, that all in Jerusalem, all those people who were afraid? What did they do? I wonder about that. Did they stick close to Herod? Did they have misgivings after they saw what happened? And if they did, what did they do? What was their response? These are questions I wonder about as I think about our times. And then there were the Magi. What about the Magi? They do what Herod tells them to do at first. They follow the star, they listen to Herod, and they're overcome with joy when they finally see Jesus in the manger. But then they have a dream warning them not to go back. And it says they go home by another way. But I wonder about those Magi. I wonder if they were tempted to ignore the dream, to throw in their lot with Herod and everyone else in Jerusalem who was afraid, and to go back and report what they'd seen. In some ways, it would have been easier, especially in the short run. Sometimes it's just easier to stay on the way you know than the way you don't know. And they've been stepping out a lot from their home territory. Were they tempted at all to just ignore that nagging feeling that something was amiss? To ignore the dream or the light that burned in their hearts having seen the Christ child? It reminds me a little bit of that incredible story about Samuel. I love that story. Who night after night has this dream and he hears someone calling, but he doesn't know it's the Lord. And he'd go to Eli who had taken care of him, who his mother Hannah had trusted to care for him, who'd been given the child promised by God, and she gives him to Eli. He goes to Eli, his mentor, and he's reassured. Eli tells him, it's okay, go back to bed. Until one time, Eli says to Samuel, maybe it's God that's calling you. And so the next time Samuel goes, he says, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. But then Samuel hears something that he's scared of, something he doesn't want to hear, that the house of Eli, the one who he loves, is going to be destroyed because of the sins of Eli's sons. And not only that, he has to go and tell this to Eli. And I love how it says he goes back to bed and just waits till morning, till he comes to deliver the bad news. Stepping out on this journey of faith, being called by God, going home by another way, that is no easy thing. And if it feels easy, we might be on the wrong track. And then we have our gospel lesson, another great passage. I love this passage from John. In fact, I love it so much, I wish it had started a few verses earlier at the start of the chapter, because this whole chapter is about the calling of the disciples. And in John, Jesus is like the Pied Piper. He walks, and all along the way, he invites a whole host of people to come and see. He's not discriminating. It's not just the 12 like in all the other gospels. John doesn't call out the particular 12. In John, it's anybody and everybody. He walks by John the Baptist, and John the Baptist says almost casually to 2 of his disciples, look, there's the Lamb of God. And so they start to follow Jesus, and Jesus can tell. And he turns around and he says, what are you looking for? And they ask him where he's staying, and he says, come and see. So that's the first version of a calling. And then we have Andrew, who invites Simon to come along. And then the next day it's Philip. That's where our passage comes in. And Jesus says to Philip, follow me. They're all called in different ways and through different chains. And then we read Philip finds Nathanael, and Nathanael's first response is, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Come and see, Philip says. And on it goes in John's gospel, calling people everywhere he travels. But like the Magi, this journey to come and see, to follow Jesus, it wasn't all lightness and joy. That was a part of it. They traveled together, they enjoyed communion with one another. In fact, right after this chapter, we have the wedding at Cana in Galilee, and they have a big time there, food, wine, drink. It's all good. But right after that wedding, Jesus takes them into the temple and he turns the tables over and he drives out the money changers who are taking advantage of people, keeping their hands pressed down on the poor. And suddenly the disciples begin to realize this journey's dangerous. What was I thinking when I said, come and see? It won't be easy. Things began to get really real. Well, that's about how I feel right now with what we've seen going on in this country. Things have gotten really real. What does it mean to follow Jesus in this time? To come and see? And especially when we're seeing so many other versions or interpretations of what it means to follow Jesus. 3 things to take from our gospel passage. First of all, hospitality. Jesus first sees 2 anonymous disciples following him, walking behind him, and they ask Jesus, "Where are you staying?" And he says, "Come and see. Come and make your home with me." The invitation is open. Jesus welcomes them in. And everywhere he goes, he welcomes people in. He issues this invitation, come and see. And interestingly, most of the people he welcomes, they're nobodies. People who weren't welcomed into others' homes. People no one particularly wants to see, the desperate, the crippled who hang by the gates of Siloam, fishermen, women, people on the outside, Samaritans, Roman soldiers, tax collectors. And I find that interesting to think about right now, when so many people in this country are feeling unseen and unheard. As we think about all the different people who feel outside of any power, who feel, and many are, unseen and unheard. If we say come and see to everyone we encounter, then we begin to ask, well, what is the final measure for our community of faith that welcomes all into its fold, that builds itself around this tall measure of hospitality? It's a tall measure. What is the final defining feature of our community of faith? It's love. If you see and you witness words and acts of love, you know that Christ is there. Christ is in its midst. But if you see and witness something other than that, beware of wolves in sheep's clothing, or maybe like Herod, wolves in wolves' clothing. Pay attention. Hospitality, God's love. The second thing in our passage is this business of truth-telling. Jesus tells the truth. When he meets people on the road, especially in John's gospel, he names them for who they are, in their brokenness and in their belovedness. We see that today with Nathanael. He names for Nathanael who he is. He saw him under the fig tree. This is the Israelite in whom there is no deceit. And in doing that, Nathanael is set free. Jesus sees him fully as he is. Jesus is known and seen and loved, or Nathanael's known and seen and loved by Jesus. And this sets him free. We see that over and over again in John's gospel, naming the truth and being set free. There's never been a more important time in our civic life now than to tell the truth, to name it, to cut through the lies, the conspiracies, the hearsay, and to keep our eyes focused on what is true. And if we're having a hard time figuring that out, dig a little deeper. Keep our eyes focused on what is factually true and true about what we believe about our faith in Jesus, our suffering servant, our self-sacrificing and forgiving God who offers shelter to the poor and the dispossessed, the least of these. We got to get clear on that because now is the time. Get clear on the truth, not just inside your head and not just to yourself, but to others around you. And especially when you're hearing a different narrative being played out as truth, especially about what it means to follow Jesus, but in all aspects of our civic life, naming the truth. This is about justice. It's love in word and action. One last thing from the passage. So we have hospitality, we have truth-telling. Lastly, we have humility. Now that's a word we're not hearing much these days. Give me just a few good leaders who know a little bit about humility. Going back to our lesson, notice how Jesus responds when Nathanael says, before he's even met Jesus, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Notice how Jesus responds to that. He doesn't get defensive. He doesn't get his back up. He doesn't make Nathanael pay for what he said. In fact, he does the opposite. He praises Nathanael. Here's an Israelite in whom there's no deceit. He recognizes Nathanael's humanity. He sees the good and he turns toward it and he names it. He names the truth. Even when Nathanael's dubious about him before he's even gotten a word out of his mouth. What does that tell us about humility in Jesus? What does that tell us about God's love? It's the same humility, the same kind of humility that leads Jesus to say on the cross, forgive them for they know not what they do. It's called kenosis. That's the fancy word in the church, self-emptying love. That is the heart of Jesus's gospel, and it's the hardest thing of all. Love your enemies. Love beyond their hatred, their violence, their cruelty. Love as Jesus teaches us to love, and it is not easy. But we have giants who've shown us the way, giants all around us. And lest we assume it was easy for them, all we have to do is go back and read accounts of their lives, the saints of our church, our civil rights leaders. Go back and read some of those accounts. It took discipline. It took courage. It took clarity and depth of spirit and trust in God and in God's overarching love for this world. For many of these people, it took their lives. And I think it's important to know it didn't just come to them. It wasn't just something they could naturally do to love their enemies. It took discipline and trust. I've been reading about John Lewis, and I've just been struck by, he went to trainings around the country to learn how to be a nonviolent protester. He didn't just show up on the Pettus Bridge and think he could muscle through this. There was a lot that went on. This kind of love, this self-sacrificing love that embraces even those who are the enemy, it doesn't come from any power other than God. It can't be achieved on its own. It can't be willed on its own because it speaks of a different power, a different kingdom, one that we pray will come on earth as it is in heaven. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King called it the arc that bends towards justice. Gandhi called it satyagraha, the method for protesting that so shaped the lives of Martin Luther King and people like John Lewis and C.T. Vivian, and it gave them courage and the deep wells of strength they needed to move forward in the face of hatred. It is love based on a sure and unchanging and abiding trust in God, whose promise never to leave us and to guide our feet while we walk this way. one of the funny things about John's gospel, and sometimes I found it kind of hard to wrap my mind around, is that Jesus in the Gospel of John, from start to finish, is unchanging. He's sure and he's clear about the journey, about him going to the cross. He's sure about keeping his eye on the prize, even from the very beginning. There's just this resoluteness to him, and I think I'm beginning to appreciate that more. It's a comfort. We're being led by the Christ who's got his eyes on the prize, born out of a complete and total trust in God, who is with him and he is in God, and whose spirit is working itself out in this world. No turning back. The light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. What a comfort that is. God is marching on. We're just travelers with Jesus. So let me close with a poem about traveling, and I love it. It's by Denise Levertov, one of my favorite poets, and it is called A Traveler. And before I read it, I'll just say, I think this poem captures, if we're truly honest with ourselves, this allure that we all have to power, to the intoxicating temptation to live for ourselves, rather than follow a different way altogether. May God walk with us as we all travel home by another way. So, A Traveler. I'm going to actually read it from my book. If it's chariots or sandals, I'll take sandals. I like the high prow of the chariot, the daredevil speed, the wind, a quick tune you can't quite catch. But I want to go a long way. And I want to follow paths where wheels deadlock. And I don't want always to be among gear and horses, blood, foam, and dust. I'd like to wean myself from their strange allure. I'll chance the pilgrim sandals. Amen.